History does not explain the granite embankments of St. Petersburg. It excuses them. It throws out a few names, a few dates, a few glorified portraits of emperors and architects, and expects you to accept that with 18th century tools, in a swamp, in a frozen delta, an empire casually wrapped its newborn capital in precision-cut stone that even our modern equipment struggles to replicate. That is not an explanation. That is a cover story. And once you start to look closely at the stone itself, at the geometry, at the logistics, you realize something uncomfortable. Someone, at some point, built on a scale and with a mastery that does not fit neatly into the official script. The granite remembers a version of the past that our textbooks refuse to print. Night falls early on the Neva. Streetlights smear their pale yellow glare across the water, and the granite absorbs it like a black mirror. Walk along the embankment when the city grows quiet, and you will see what tourists never really register in daylight. Massive blocks of red and gray granite lie in smooth, unbroken lines, their faces polished to a sheen that barely ripples under your fingertips. The joints between them are so tight that a blade of a knife cannot slide in. There is no visible mortar, no crumbling layer of lime, just stone pressed to stone with unnerving precision. Monolithic steps descend to the water in perfect rhythm. Each tread identically shaped, the edges crisp despite more than 2 centuries of ice, thaw, and pollution. Bronze lions crouch on pedestals that do not sag, that do not shift, as if the earth beneath them has forgotten how to move. Now layer this scene over the official story you have heard. 18th century Russia, young St. Petersburg, a city built on marshland by decree of a willful czar. Peasant labor, simple cranes of wood and rope, primitive chisels and hammers, horse carts hauling stone through mud, draftsmen scratching plans by candlelight on paper that curls from damp. All of that is true on the surface. But then look again at the embankment, at the seamless curvature of the corners, at the enormous monoliths used in some staircases, at the perfect alignments over hundreds of meters. Does this feel like the improvisation of a rushed frontier capital? Or does it look like something else entirely? Something systematic, industrial, almost mechanized? Let us start with the stone itself. The granite for St. Petersburg's embankments comes primarily from quarries in Karelia and nearby regions. That means blocks weighing many tons had to be extracted, shaped, transported over dozens and sometimes hundreds of kilometers, and then placed with millimetric accuracy in a city that was, at the time, effectively a construction site on waterlogged soil. We are told this was done with wooden sledges, barges dragged by hand or by horses, ropes made of hemp, and tools of iron softer than the stone they cut. No steam engines, no diesel cranes, no diamond-tipped saws, no electric polishers. And yet the surfaces gleam with a uniformity one would expect from machine-ground stone, not from men with chisels and sand. Have you ever watched a modern team install a single granite slab for a facade? They use steel frameworks, adjustable mounts, cranes, laser levels, and still they struggle to achieve a seamless plane over a few meters. Now look at the embankments along the Admiralty, along the English embankment near the Academy of Arts. Their lines extend for hundreds of meters, turning at right angles into new segments without visible deviation. The horizontal planes remaining level despite subsidence of the city around them. Did a handful of 18th century foremen, trained in an empire that had barely begun to industrialize, suddenly manifest a mastery of stone engineering that rivaled what Europe would only standardize a century later? The official answer is simple. They were just very skilled. A convenient phrase that keeps you from asking uncomfortable questions. Skilled at what exactly? At cutting perfectly cylindrical granite columns for the Isakievsky Cathedral, each weighing dozens of tons? at towing stone monoliths across wet terrain where heavy equipment today would sink without extensive groundwork, at polishing rough blocks to a reflective finish using nothing more than sand, grit, and enough time. Time is not a tool. Time does not drill, grind, or lift. Time only reveals whether your structure was actually sound to begin with. One of the quietest paradoxes of St. Petersburg is that the city looks, in many places, as if it were laid out for stone first and people later. Walk from the Winter Palace down to the water and feel the transition. The architecture of the facade is ornate, yes, but it breathes the 19th century. Neoclassical details, decorative flourishes, a language we can decode. Then step to the very edge where stone meets water. Suddenly the style becomes colder, more abstract, almost brutal in its simplicity. Giant blocks, clean lines, an obsession with flatness, straightness, geometry. It is as if two eras cohabit the same space. An upper costume drama of painted stucco perched on a lower skeleton that feels far older, harder, and more enigmatic. We are told that under Empress Anna, princes and counts demanded granite embankments to protect their palaces from erosion. Later, in the reign of Catherine, the great granite cladding of the Neva truly accelerated. Bureaucratic orders remain in the archives. Lists of contractors, budgets, deadlines. On paper, everything looks legitimate. But paper can only tell you what someone wanted recorded. Stone, on the other hand, tells you what was actually done. When documentation and physical evidence diverge, which one do you trust? The neat ink of a scribe serving imperial politics, or the mute testimony of thousands of tons of rock shaped beyond the apparent capacity of its time? Consider the tolerances. Many blocks in the embankments are fitted with joints so fine that they resist even modern attempts to probe them. This is not random. It is the product of an intentional technique. You do not accidentally achieve repeated 90-degree angles on massive granite pieces with hand tools, under variable weather, on swampy ground, unless you possess a highly formalized method of measuring and cutting. Where are the detailed technical treatises from the 18th century describing such advanced workflow? Where are the survivor tools that show the wear marks of continual granite polishing? Museums can show you cannons, uniforms, porcelain, clocks, decorative carvings. But the core industrial technology to create this stone infrastructure is conspicuously absent. Reduced to vague mentions of stonecutters and quarries in secondary texts. And then there is the question of scale. St. Petersburg was not built slowly and organically over centuries like many European cities. It was decreed into existence in a few decades. To clothe kilometers of waterfront in dressed granite within that time frame, in a climate of damp cold and short building seasons, would require not just manpower, but a high-throughput system. Standardized modules, reliable logistics, repeatable procedures. That is how modern large-scale projects function. According to the official narrative, the empire had no such system then. It simply had brute labor, coercion, and improvisation. Yet the product that remains, these embankments, look less like the chaotic efforts of a feudal state and more like the outputs of a disciplined, high-capacity infrastructure machine. A quiet architectural detail reveals even more. In certain segments, the embankment walls have hidden recesses, niches, and seemingly purposeless protrusions. Some align faintly with now lost small piers, some with former gates, but others line up with nothing of present record. The geometry hints at docks, loading bays, or attachment points for structures no longer there. It is as though the granite was originally integrated into a larger system of waterways and mechanical movement that was later dismantled or repurposed. Why would a young capital invest such intelligent stonework into ephemeral, temporary needs? Or did the city simply adapt a pre-existing stone framework, dressing it with its own narrative afterward? Once you begin to suspect that the stone might predate the story attached to it, a different picture emerges. The granite embankments cease to be an 18th century triumph of Russian engineering and start looking like the exposed interface of a much older, non-documented urban system. A skeleton city of stone that already knew how to meet the water, around which the Romanov project built its palaces and monuments. The official history of St. Petersburg insists that before Peter, the region was merely a scatter of forts and villages. Yet the speed and audacity of the city's rise make more sense if, beneath the mud and reeds, there were already foundations, literal and figurative, to build upon. At this point, defenders of the conventional narrative will say, there is no evidence of an earlier advanced civilization there. But think of what counts as evidence in academic terms. Properly stratified archaeological finds, written records, dated artifacts. Now overlay on that requirement a city that has been repeatedly rebuilt, flooded, renovated, burned, shelled, and beautified for more than 2 centuries. Granaries became museums, bastions became parks, industrial zones became prestige districts. How much of the original stone infrastructure has been cleaned, resurfaced, refaced, or quietly replaced without ever being examined with the assumption that it could be older than the empire itself? Notice, too, that some of the most technically astonishing granite works in St. Petersburg are linked to themes of power, control, and cosmic order. The Bronze Horseman, Peter's statue on a gigantic pedestal of granite, supposedly transported by miraculous efforts across swamps. The Egyptian sphinxes on the Universitetskaya embankment, grafted into an already carefully calibrated stone quay. The rostral columns on Vasilyevsky Island, their pedestals and surroundings bound into the embankments like a ritual stage. The city's granite is not only functional, it is symbolic. It encodes a message: stability over chaos, stone over water, empire over the wild. Was this symbolism invented whole in the 18th century? Or was it inherited, reinterpreted from an older, almost mythic layout of stone and current? Let us return to the tools. 18th century documents mention wedges, hammers, saws with iron blades, abrasives. That, we are told, is enough. But experimenters who try to replicate polished granite surfaces with such tools quickly run into limits. Progress is slow, uneven, imprecise. Achieving one near-perfect block is possible with sufficient care. Achieving thousands, consistent in dimension and finish, is another matter entirely. You can stack the manpower of an empire on that problem, but sheer quantity does not substitute for precision technology. At some scale of complexity, you either have specialized machinery, whether powered by water, steam, some lost principle, or something we do not yet understand, or you simply fail to produce uniform results. So where are the machines? What if they are gone because they were never part of the Romanov era to begin with? What if the empire stumbled upon the remains of a prior industrial infrastructure whose tools had already vanished, leaving only durable stone traces? Previously existing quarries with inexplicably straight cuts. Granite docks half buried in river silt, massive blocks already shaped, lying unused in forests. In such a scenario, Peter's engineers would have become not pure builders, but scavengers and curators, assembling a new capital out of harvested fragments of a lost system. The embankments would then be mosaics of repurposed precision, recut and fitted where possible, masking their own deeper origin. At this point, you might ask, why would anyone hide this? Why not simply admit, we found earlier works and built upon them? Because an empire derives legitimacy from being the apex of its narrative. If you stand in front of your people as ruler of the land, you do not say, "We are tenants in the remains of a forgotten civilization that outperformed us in key aspects." You claim to be the civilizer, not the inheritor. Acknowledging previous mastery implies that your control is temporary, your cultural story incomplete. It invites comparisons that diminish your glory. So the obvious reaction is to absorb, repaint, rename, and overwrite. Granite quays become imperial embankments. Undated stone structures are assigned convenient construction years. The past is folded into your myth. Right here, halfway through this investigation, I will ask you directly, do you feel the weight of the stone story pressing against the official pages of history? If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. Engagement is not just an algorithmic game. It is a signal that people are ready to question the comfortable patterns they have been handed. Now, let us push further. The geometry of the embankments, when mapped with modern tools, reveals another layer of order. Distances between key points, between bridges, between staircases, between certain corners, fall into neat ratios, repeating intervals, hidden harmonies of measure. It begins to resemble an engineer's grid rather than an ad hoc arrangement driven solely by land plots and politics. Yet, 18th century records, when they mention planning, speak mostly of aesthetic perspectives, parade routes, and access to palaces. Who, then, enforced this deeper metric logic? Was there an inherited template? A ghost plan that constrained later architects without them fully knowing why certain lines simply worked and others did not? Think about the repeated pattern across the world. Monumental stonework whose technology seems to exceed its stated era, wrapped later in grand but more fragile architecture. In Egypt, massive stone foundations, cyclopean blocks, over which later dynasties tacked on decorated facades and used plastered brick for everyday life. In Peru, polygonal stones locked so tightly that not even a needle fits between them, topped later by colonial buildings that crumble in earthquakes while the old stone stands. In St. Petersburg, do we not see a similar dual city? A lower city of granite, cold and rigorous, and an upper city of stucco, brick, and paint, forever needing repairs. The similarities go beyond aesthetics. In many of these places, the stories about how the stone was worked come down as half myths, half dogma. They used copper tools and sand. They brought stones on logs. They were just very organized. Phrases that sound plausible until you run the numbers, measure the tolerances, and realize that the margin between possible and achieved is uncomfortably thin. Again and again, the same pattern emerges. Where evidence of advanced stone technology should exist, there is instead a gapy, filled by confident but hollow assurances. St. Petersburg's granite embankments therefore become more than an architectural curiosity. They serve as a local chapter in a broader, global puzzle. A pattern of civilizations appearing in places already structured by stone, of new powers inheriting, adapting, and then burying stories of what came before, sometimes literally under layers of fill and reconstruction. Is it so unlikely that the Neva Delta once hosted an earlier, denser network of engineered waterways and stone quays, perhaps from a maritime culture that mastered river deltas and cold climates, whose remnants survived as anonymous boulders and outcrops, until someone with an imperial decree decided to make them useful once more? Look closely at historical paintings of early St. Petersburg. Many show wooden buildings, cranes, barges, scaffolding. But in the background, often rendered with surprising care, you will see solid stone edges, straight lines along the river that seem more finished than the buildings above them. Artists sometimes painted what they saw, even when it conflicted with official stories. A wooden city clinging to a stone skeleton. The documents may date the finishing of certain embankment segments to this or that reign, but the art betrays a sense that the most decisive stone boundaries were already there, insisting on their own geometry while everything else shifted. Another clue lies beneath the waterline. Divers who have inspected parts of the embankments report submerged stone courses extending deeper than expected, in some cases with different cutting styles than the visible layers. Step profiles, promontories, strange offsets that no longer serve any practical function for modern shipping. In a purely 18th and 19th century context, such inefficiencies make little sense. Stone was expensive and labor-intensive. You build what you need, not redundant terraces under murky water. But if you are grafting your visible embankment onto the stump of an older, perhaps taller or differently purposed structure, these anomalies start to look like the surviving anatomy of something reconfigured, not created from scratch. Could these prior structures be remnants of a civilization we might call pre-imperial northern? Some culture that mastered heavy stone and hydrology in cold regions, whose settlements were later flattened by cataclysms of ice, flood, or political erasure. Conventional archaeology does not currently recognize such a culture in the Neva Delta. Yet the embankments whisper otherwise. They stand too quietly perfect, too stubbornly precise, for us to accept that a feudal empire at the edge of Europe, still importing basic expertise from abroad, suddenly achieved a level of granite control that mirrored achievements thousands of kilometers away along other great rivers. At this point, the skeptic in you will ask, is there not a risk of seeing patterns where none exist, of falling into the seduction of a grand conspiracy? Yes, there is. That is why we do not rely on mood or metaphor. We rely on the stone, on its measurable qualities. We compare what is claimed with what is observable. We examine logistics, timelines, documented technologies, and recorded workforce capacities. When the story and the material reality align, suspicion has no fuel. But when you find, as here, repeated mismatches, implausible efficiency, unexplainable precision, ambiguous depth, and strangely absent technical detail in contemporaneous records, a responsible mind does not shrug and repeat the textbook. It asks who had the means, the motive, and the machinery. Motive may, in the end, be the simplest part. For an emerging empire, the granite embankments represented power embodied. They turned a treacherous, muddy riverbank into a controlled, disciplined edge. Stone replaced marsh. Lines replaced chaos. It told subjects and foreigners alike, this is not a frontier. This is the center. If, to achieve this image, the empire repurposed older stoneworks, mined ancient keys, and quietly erased their origins from official memory, that would have been a small price to pay for narrative dominance. Every regime rewrites the ground it stands on. The difference here is that the revision may have extended all the way into our understanding of who first tamed the Neva's waters with stone. So we return to the original question. How were these granite embankments truly built with 18th century tools? Perhaps the most honest answer is, they were not. At least, not entirely. 18th century Russia clearly undertook massive efforts. Organizing labor, transporting stone, reshaping segments, polishing faces, and integrating the embankments into its urban plan. But the base technology of perfectly fitted, large-scale granite modules may have been at least partially inherited, not invented. The empire's tools finished a job, dressed it, adapted it, but did not conceive from zero the system it now claims as its own. Once you accept that possibility, another realization follows. If one capital can quietly rest on the remains of an earlier technological order, then our broader history may be similarly layered. The timeline we learn in school shows a clean progression: primitive to advanced, dark to enlightened, local to global. But stone has its own chronology, one that does not care for tidy narratives. In St. Petersburg, the granite embankments become a crack in the official surface through which an older, stranger light seeps. A glimpse of civilizations misaligned with our chronology. Of knowledge lost, then rediscovered only as material heritage stripped of context. You can continue to walk along the Neva and tell yourself the same comfortable story: peasants, picks, and patience. Or you can allow the stone to challenge you. You can run your hand along those cold, smooth blocks and admit that they feel, in their perfection, like a message from a hand more practiced than the one history assigns. That is not mysticism. That is observation. The conspiracy is not that there is a secret order running the world. The conspiracy is that our official history trains us not to ask certain questions when the evidence stands right in front of us. In the end, the granite embankments of St. Petersburg do exactly what they were meant to do. They hold the line between land and water. But quietly, they hold another line as well. Between the story we are told about our past and the story the physical world hints at. The more you study their cuts, their joints, their depth, the more difficult it becomes to believe they are merely the straightforward work of 18th century tools used by exhausted laborers under imperial whips. Something older, more capable, passed here first, leaving a framework of stone that an empire could not resist claiming as its own. So when you stand on that granite edge and watch the Neva slide by, understand what you are really seeing. Not just a river, not just a city, not just a romantic northern skyline. You are standing on the edited surface of history, on the polished face of a deeper infrastructure whose origin has been reassigned, whose memory has been wiped clean in the archives, yet preserved in every perfect joint beneath your feet. The closing revelation is simple and unsettling. If the embankments lie, then so does the narrative built upon them. And once you notice that the stone does not match the story, you can never again pretend that official history is anything more than a carefully cut veneer over a much older, much less comfortable truth.